Did you know? You can be in your 30s right now in Canada and be a residential school survivor. That means you actually went to residential school. This is not something that happened way back in the past.
Gordon's Indian Residential School was a boarding school for George Gordon First Nation students in Peniche, Saskatchewan, and was the last federally funded residential school in Canada. Between 1876 and 1946, the school was managed by the Anglican Church of Canada under the auspices of the Diocese of Capel. It was then managed by the church's Indian and Eskimo Welfare Commission, and later its Indian School Administration. In April 1969, administration for the school was transferred to the Government of Canada. From then onward, the Anglican Church provided chaplaincy services to the school. In 1996, Gordon Student Residence was closed and the main building was demolished.
Between 1831 and 1996, for upwards of 100 years, the Canadian government worked in tandem with church-run schools to forcibly remove Indigenous children from their families and communities and put them in notoriously abusive institutions called Indian residential schools. During this chapter, more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forced to attend these schools, many of which were hundreds of miles from home.
What I have come to understand is that First Nations and non-First Nations people are bound together in a relationship. For many decades now, it has been a dysfunctional and at times hostile relationship. None of us can change what happened before, but we all have the power to decide what kind of relationship will exist in the future. MP Charlie Angus, author, Children of the Broken Treaty.
September 30th is Orange Shirt Day. It is a day of national observance remembering the thousands of Indigenous children who were stolen from their homes and placed in residential schools across Canada. Phyllis Webstat was 6 years old when her granny bought for her a beautiful orange shirt to wear to the mission school she was attending near Dog Creek Reserve in British Columbia. Phyllis was proud of that shirt. It was taken from her when she arrived, and with that shirt, her entire childhood. If you see people wearing an orange shirt in your community on this day, they are making a simple, outward statement communicating the truth and consequences of residential schools and support for the survivors and their families.
I am honored to be able to tell my story so that others may benefit and understand. Phyllis Webstat.
Remember the R timeline. Resources, racist policies, rebuttal, residential schools, reserves, RCMP, railway, research, recoveries, recent, resilience, reconciliation.
It is no secret that Canada has a wealth of resources. From water to lumber to minerals, oil, fishing, and more. The resources we rely on in our current economy were sought after by explorers hundreds of years ago. This timeline shows that, simply and crudely put, Indigenous communities were in the way of the British Empire's effort to exploit the land and settle on it. The doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius justified the Crown's forced control over Indigenous land in Canada. The doctrine of discovery stems from a series of papal bulls, or formal statements from the Pope, and extensions, originating in the 1400s during the Age of Discovery. The doctrine of discovery gave moral and legal right for Christian governments to invade and claim sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and land by holding that Indigenous peoples cannot claim ownership of land. In March 2023, the Vatican released a statement denouncing the doctrine of discovery that Canadian governments have used to justify colonization for centuries. It is important to note that the Vatican statement has not yet been followed by attempts to make actionable amends at the highest level of Catholic governance. Between 1871 and 1921, the federal government set about to obtain legal control over Indigenous lands through a series of numbered post-Confederation treaties, 1 through 11. The treaties were designed to give Ottawa certainty in its control over the lands while bringing the Indigenous people under the care of the federal government. In Northern Ontario, a number of bands had been calling on the government for years to sign a treaty because they believed that a legal agreement with the Crown would provide protection from encroachment on their territory. In the summers of 1905 and 1906, Ottawa-born Duncan Campbell Scott served as one of the federal government's commissioners for Treaty 9. He and two other commissioners, Samuel Stewart and Daniel McMartin, made their way across northern Ontario by river to affix signatures to a treaty stating that the said Indians do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of the Dominion of Canada for His Majesty the King and his successors forever, all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever, to the said land containing an area of 90,000 square miles, more or less.
In exchange for signing Treaty 9, the Indigenous peoples were promised reserves, money, education, later provided by residential schools, and rights to hunt and fish, while the government received the right to open the region to development projects such as mining, lumbering, railway, construction, immigration, and trade. Within 2 years, the bands would agree to extinguish all rights to their lands in exchange for a small annual payment from the government of $4 to $5 per person and the education of their children. The treaty was a written legal agreement, but the people who signed it were an oral-based culture. At Fort Hope, Chief Munius openly questioned the deal, asking why they were being paid money if there would be no impact on their lives. Munius, one of the most influential chiefs, asked a number of questions. He said that ever since he was able to earn anything, and that was from the time he was young, he had never been given something for nothing, that he always had to pay for everything that he got. Now, he says, you gentlemen come to us from the king offering to give us benefits for which we can make no return. How is this?
Duncan Campbell Scott soon undermined his promise. He enclosed the language required to break the promise on education in the legal nuance of the treaty, that government would provide education as may seem advisable. Scott's idea of education for Indigenous children was to deliver the most basic rudimentary education with as little cost to the federal government as possible. He was appointed Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1913, a position he held until 1932 and played a central role in the expansion of the residential school system. From the Indigenous perspective, this was a land-sharing agreement. From the government's perspective, the treaty effectively surrendered Indigenous title to the land. Many descendants of the Cree and Ojibwe signatories contend that their ancestors agreed to the treaty based on false pretenses. They argue that the written text of Treaty 9 does not include all the protections and concessions that Scott and other government representatives had verbally promised.
After well over 150 years worth of colonization and natural resource extraction, the per-person treaty annuity remains $4 to $5 per person.
Racist policies.
As Canada was settled by the British and French from the 1840s onward, pre-Confederation legislation codified anti-Indigenous racist policies and acts in order to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. These policies and acts use colonial Puritan culture and Christianity to justify this calculated displacement.
How do we know that the government's intention was to assimilate Indigenous people almost 200 years ago? How is this intention proven? Good questions. Keep reading. Canadians have the opportunity to self-educate through some basic tools like searching through government archives and reading books from historians. Documents including letters, research, and incriminating quotes prove the intention of government. And most importantly, these intentions are confirmed by the personal testimonies of residential school survivors. The following reports prove, through language and intent, the government's willingness to assimilate the Indigenous population. 1845 to 1847, the Bagot Commission and Ryerson Report. 1857, the Gradual Civilization Act. 1872, the Dominion Lands Act. 1876, the Indian Act. 1879, the Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds.
It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lost their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of the department, which is geared towards a final solution of the Indian problem. Quote by Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs from 1913 until 1932. It is the opinion of the writer that the government will in time reach the end of its responsibility as the Indians progress into civilization and finally disappear as a separate and distinct people, not by race extinction, but by gradual assimilation with their fellow citizens. Quote in 1931 by Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs from 1913 until 1932.
Sir John A. Macdonald. As the joint premier of the Province of Canada before Canadian Confederation, Macdonald was a leader in the creation of the Gradual Civilization Act, 1857, which transformed into the Indian Act in 1876. The Gradual Civilization Act aimed to enfranchise First Nations men into settler society, that is, Province of Canada, and in the process turn lands of Indigenous nations into private property, which could be taxed by settler governments. In this act, Indigenous women and children under 21 were attached to the men in their lives, a settler ideology and practice of heteropatriarchy imposed through this legislation. Macdonald was a leader in the creation of British North America Act 1867. Included in Section 91 is item number 24, which legislates federal jurisdiction over, quote, Indian and lands reserved for the Indians. This action of unilaterally creating federal jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples goes against treaties negotiated between Indigenous nations and the Crown, negotiated being in nation-to-nation relations with each other, not one nation controlling and subjugating others.
What else do we know about Macdonald? Macdonald authorized the pass system, which required First Nations to obtain permission from their Indian agent to leave their reserve. His government also criminalized powwows and potlatches. Both policies would persist well into the 20th century. Macdonald was key in the implementation of the residential school policy that took 150,000 Indigenous children from their families to suffer cultural genocide. Macdonald created the Northwest Mounted Police, the precursor of the RCMP, which incarcerates more Indigenous people per capita than any other racial group in Canada.
When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself, as head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men. Sir John A. Macdonald, 1879.
Rebuttal. Macdonald's views and actions are justified because that's just how everyone thought back then.
Rebuttal. Leading researchers have demonstrated that, even by the standards of his own day, Macdonald stood out for his racist beliefs. Macdonald's actions can thus be measured against his own contemporaries and still be found wanting.
Renaming public spaces and removing statues is erasing history.
Rebuttal. It is not erasing history or rewriting it. It is working toward the understanding that in light of new evidence and in every new context, it is incumbent on us to lend new meaning to the lessons of the past, the communities we inhabit as Canadian citizens, and the future of our education systems.
Macdonald is a significant part of Canadian history.
Rebuttal. There is a difference between significant and worthy of honoring. We must acknowledge MacDonald's role in establishing a parliamentary democracy steeping in racism and white supremacy that still oppresses Indigenous and other racialized communities.
Residential schools. In 1879, Prime Minister MacDonald commissioned journalist and politician Nicholas Flood Davin to study industrial schools for Indigenous children in the United States. Nicholas Flood Davin was impressed with the method of funding Indian schools, whereby the government provided a set amount per student to the church that operated the schools. The main recommendation made by Davin was that the federal government should institute a contract method of education. Quote, wherever the missionaries have schools, the government should utilize those schools. If possible, that is to say, a contract should be made with the religious body controlling the school to the board and to educate and train industrially a certain number of pupils. Although church-run schools had already been operated in early Canada for almost 100 years at that point, Davin's recommendation to follow the U.S. example of aggressive civilization led to public funding for the residential school system in 1883.
Children as young as 5 years old were taken far away from their families and communities, where they were punished for speaking their own languages or practicing their traditions. This systemic racism was meticulously crafted to, quote, kill the Indian in the child, through indoctrinating them into Euro-Canadian and Christian ways of living and assimilating them into mainstream Canadian society. Children were often abused for the duration of the years they were forced to live in the schools, creating an enduring legacy of secrecy, shame, and pain for generations of Indigenous people. From the book Up Ghost River, author Edmund Meditawaban, a St. Anne's residential school survivor, writes, in the residential schools, the secrecy began at dawn. We were beaten from the time we first awoke. Speaking out against the injustice in letters home was also cause for punishment. We coped in whatever way we could, often by imitating our oppressors.
From author John S. Milroy's book, A National Crime, Milroy writes, in 1939, 9,027 children are in 79 residential schools run by Catholic churches. This is a 60% stake in the residential school system. The Anglican Church ran 25% of the schools, and the United and Presbyterian churches also ran residential schools. Milroy suggests that 1939 was the approximate midpoint of the history of our system.
Inuit experience. Inuits are the Indigenous peoples living in the 51 communities spread across Inuit Nunangat, which is comprised of Inuvialuit, Northwest Territories and Yukon, Nunavik, Northern Quebec, Nunatsiavut, Labrador, and Nunavut. The term Inuit Nunangat is a Canadian Inuit term that includes land, water, and ice. Inuit consider the land, water, and ice of their homeland to be integral to their culture and way of life. Inuit have lived in their homeland since time immemorial. Amongst the most culturally resilient in North America, roughly 60% of Inuit report an ability to conduct a conversation in Inuktitut.
Pictured above left, a photo from 1960 in Igliote by John Stanners. Pictured above right, a photo from 1958 in Igliote from the Library and Archives Canada. Pictured below is Geraldine Moody in 1905 as printed in The Guardian, 2017. It was not until the 1950s that church-run and federally, provincially, or ecclesiastically funded schools were operating in the Canadian North. Before 1939, Inuit were not considered Indians, which meant that the Canadian government did not see itself as directly responsible for their welfare or education. On April 5, 1939, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that Inuit were Indians under the British North America Act of 1867, making the federal government responsible for their health, welfare, and education.
While Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Moravian missionaries independently provided education focused on religious instruction after World War II, concerns over Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic led to increased attention on the North. In 1951, Canada announced an education plan for Northerners and Inuit. In 1954, the Department of Northern Affairs and National Resources recommended introducing the residential school system across the North, believing it to be the most effective way to educate children from the primitive environments and prepare them for the white man's economy.
Pictured, a photo from the Rooms Provincial Archives, 1912. Also pictured, a photo from the archives of the St. Boniface Historical Society.
It was hard for my parents. Very, very hard. First of all, they didn't want to put me in school. These people came around from the government telling them that if you didn't send any of your kids to the residential schools, you're not going to get your family allowance anymore. They were going to have no family allowance. And that's the only thing that was the extra money, that they had besides their fur. A quote from Lillian Elias in Igliote, 2010. The struggle with violence and trauma is a result of Canada's colonization of Inuit Nunangat, in which federal government policy destabilized Inuit society by undermining their ability to be self-reliant. Inuit communities were forced to concentrate into settlements, threatened by disease, and made dependent on trade goods. These changes ushered in a new era of impoverishment of Inuit culture that, in the span of a few decades, had devastating long-term consequences.
Intergenerational trauma happens when the effects of trauma are not resolved in one generation. When trauma is ignored and there is no support for dealing with it, it is passed from one generation to the next. A tragic result of the enduring trauma experienced by Indigenous communities is the high rate of suicide among the Inuit, being 5 to 25 times the Canadian average. Systemic factors that resulted from colonization, including socioeconomic marginalization, loss of culture and language, and forced assimilation through residential schools and government policies, account for the high suicide rates among Indigenous people.
Moving forward, as defined by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, resilience is the capacity for communities, families, and individuals to spring back from adversity, more fortified and resourceful despite decades of societal stressors. On the societal level, cultural resilience is cultivated or maintained through the revival and celebration of Aboriginal beliefs and practices, which strengthen the collective capacity to withstand negative forces from within and without. Forbidden at one time by church and government, the traditional practice of tattooing connected women to their families and communities. In Inuit communities today, the art of kakinit, tattooing, continues by both modern machine work and traditional hand-poked methods. Kila, a tattooed Inuit woman from the Dolphin and Union Strait area, Coronation Gulf, NWT, Nunavut, 1916. Government of Canada, Library and Archives. Throat singing, considered one of the world's oldest form of music, is a guttural style of singing or chanting, producing multiple notes simultaneously through specialized vocalization techniques that come from the reverberation in the throat. Inuit children attending residential or day schools were not allowed to throat sing. Today, throat singing has entered mainstream music with the talent of Inuit performers, including Tanya Tagak, Tiffany Eilick, and Inuksuk McKay of Piksik, Silla, and Rise, and the Jerry Cans, to name a few.
The Canadian government and the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches operated nearly 700 Indian day schools across Canada in every province and territory except Newfoundland. Indian day schools operated for over a century, from the 1860s to 1990s. Similarly to residential schools, the purpose of the day schools was to assimilate Indigenous children and erase Indigenous language and culture. Children who attended Indian day schools faced verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Additionally, Indigenous communities were not given a say in the operation and curriculum of the schools. Quote, "In Canada, day schools existed over a longer period of time and in greater numbers than residential schools since the early 1600s, and operated with the same colonial intent of erasure of identity and assimilation into Western society as the residential schools."
There was an ally. In 1907, Dr. Peter Bryce visited Indian residential schools in the prairies. He wrote a report called Canada's National Crime and reported that between 25% to 75% of the children who went to residential schools died while they were there. The government took away his position and hid the facts from Canadians. Here is a timeline of Bryce's work. In 1907, Dr. Bryce visits 35 schools, reports appallingly unsanitary conditions, microorganisms bearing ventilation, high death rates, quote, "The almost invariable cause is tuberculosis." In 1908, Indian Affairs accountant F.H. Paget reports schools in bad condition. From 1910 to 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott acknowledges the obscene percentage of the death of Indigenous children. In 1922, Dr. Bryce publishes The Story of a National Crime, being an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada, the wards of the nation, our allies in Revolutionary War, our brother in arms in the Great War. Bryce charged that between 1894 to 1908, within 5 years of entry, 30% to 60% of the students had died. An avoidable mortality rate had healthy children not being exposed to children with tuberculosis. A trail of disease and death has gone almost unchecked by any serious efforts on the part of the Department of Indian Affairs. Bryce claimed Duncan Campbell Scott opposed his findings and recommendations in 1907.
Reserves. A handful of outspoken loyalists began to theorize and suggest that Indigenous people would be better off assimilated into British European culture, and that this could be done by minimizing Indigenous people's access to their own culture through the creation of reserves and residential schools. As Métis academic and activist Howard Adams in 1975 wrote, quote, "It is not just a coincidence that the mounted police were established during the development of Indian reserves to ensure the success of the treaty negotiations with the Indians and help relocate Indians and half-breeds to the reserves and colonies. The Mounties were not ambassadors of goodwill or uniformed men sent to protect Indians. They were the colonizers' occupational forces, and hence the oppressors of Indians and Métis."
So, what are reserves? A reserve is a land set aside by the Canadian government for use by First Nations. Reserves are managed under the Indian Act. Reserve lands represent a small fraction of the traditional territories First Nations had before European colonization. While reserves are places where members of a First Nation live, some reserves are used for hunting and other activities. Many First Nations hold more than one parcel of reserve land, and some reserves are shared by more than one First Nation. There are reserves in every province in Canada, but few have been established in the territories. Most reserves are rural, though some First Nations have created urban reserves, which are reserves within or neighboring a city. Métis and Inuit do not hold reserve land. In the early 20th century, there was a rapid increase in poverty on reserves due to imposed laws and policies. Canadian laws made it illegal for First Nations people to use traditional means of resource distribution and limited their ability to fish and hunt. An amendment to the Indian Act in 1927 also made it illegal for them to challenge their situation in court. Many First Nations people living on reserves found that they could not sustain themselves or their families. However, leaving the reserve meant facing discrimination and assimilation in the cities and giving up their status. The current surface area of all reserve land in Canada is approximately 8,866,668 acres. Canada has a total acreage of approximately 2,467,265,689 acres. As of 2017, only 0.36% of Canada's land mass has currently been set aside as reserve status.
Sir John A. Macdonald got the idea for the Mounties from the Royal Irish Constabulary, a paramilitary police force the British created to keep the Irish under control. Macdonald envisioned his own Royal Irish Constabulary, says Steve Hewitt, a senior history lecturer at the University of Birmingham and author of 3 books about the RCMP's history. Except instead of the Irish, they would control the Indigenous people already living on the land. Canada also desperately needed a paramilitary police organization to enforce its new oppressive laws, the Dominion Lands Act of 1872 and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869, which was later updated as the Indian Act in 1876, which were designed to control Indigenous peoples and redistribute their lands to settlers, in violation of the numbered treaties.
In the Western provinces, the RCMP carried out the request of the Canadian government to implement a pass system, enforce starvation methods, and generally keep care and control of the Indigenous population. The RCMP also removed children from their homes to be placed into residential schools. The RCMP's first full-scale operation was launched in 1885 against the Métis and Cree resistance in what is now Saskatchewan. But this military engagement resulted in several resounding defeats and forced retreats for the RCMP at the hands of Indigenous warriors at the battles of Duck Lake, Fort Pitt, Fish Creek, Cut Knife, and Frenchman's Butte, as well as an incident at Battleford where the RCMP simply hid inside its fort as Cree warriors briefly reoccupied the town. The RCMP was so ineffective that it needed to be saved by the Canadian Army with additional British support and leadership, which eventually was able to defeat the Indigenous resistance, leading to the judicial hangings of Louis Riel and 8 Cree and Nakota Assiniboine men. The site where Riel was hanged is still today used as the RCMP training academy. Conventional Canadian mythology maintains that the RCMP was created to protect Indigenous people from marauding Americans at Cypress Hills. But even this whitewashed story underlines the force's role in expanding and maintaining the borders of Canada while facilitating the development and infrastructure such as the Canadian Pacific Railway across Indigenous lands by whatever means necessary, from forcibly relocating Indigenous people to breaking workers' strikes. One man in particular, Sir John A. Macdonald, favored this approach. Once Indigenous people were forced out of the way, his dream of uniting Canada coast to coast via railway would be realized. Sir John A. knew he would need help, to not just displace Indigenous communities, but to keep them controlled and displaced.
Railway. In his book, Children of the Broken Treaty, MP Charlie Angus writes, quote, "The building of the Canadian Pacific Railway through the regions of the north of Lake Superior in the 1880s had a huge impact on previously isolated bands. The railway brought an influx of prospectors, trappers, timber crews, and traders. The whites were stripping the land of fur, and with them came the spread of alcohol, tuberculosis, measles, and pneumonia. In the first 5 years after his return to power in 1878, Macdonald was not only Prime Minister, he was also Minister of Indian Affairs. He oversaw the starvation and forced removal of Indigenous people from the territory of southwestern Saskatchewan onto reserves. In March of 1882, Macdonald said that the Indigenous people south of the proposed railway tracks in the territory of the Assiniboine, southwest Saskatchewan, would be removed by force if necessary. Macdonald wanted to eliminate any threat to the construction of the railway, and the government wanted the land cleared for European settlers.
In the prairies in the 1880s, First Nations and Métis groups in the Canadian prairies were not at all happy to have the train coming through their land. They had heard about the railroad in the U.S. and seen how it had helped bring death to many of the buffalo they depended on for food and shelter. Since the buffalo were harder to find, many of the First Nations had settled in one place and began a life of farming. So when the government wanted to move them to another reserve to make way for the railroad, they set to rebel. When some Cree men rose up in anger during the 1885 rebellion, the government ensured that everyone knew the result of such actions and encouraged residential school staff to usher children of Battleford Industrial School into the courtyard to witness the hanging of the men convicted of murder. Such acts were clearly intended to break the spirit of resistance, self-determination, and indeed the spirit of the children who witnessed them. In reality, Canada did not seek to protect Indigenous people, but to protect itself and settler corporate interests from further Indigenous resistance that would occur if settlers were allowed to run amok and Indigenous peoples decided to ally themselves with anyone other than Canada. Such resistance had already taken place at Red River and would soon raise its head again in the Northwest Resistance of 1885 in what is now called Saskatchewan.
Research. Ian Mosby, a historian of food, Indigenous health, and politics of Canadian settler colonialism, uncovered that between 1942 and 1952, Canada's most prominent nutrition scientists performed highly unethical research on 1,300 Indigenous people, including 1,000 children in Cree communities in northern Manitoba and at 6 residential schools across Canada. Many were already suffering from malnutrition because of destructive government policies and terrible conditions at residential schools. In the eyes of researchers, this made them ideal test subjects.
Charles Camsell Hospital. Founded in 1913, Edmonton, Alberta. Charles Camsell Hospital originally functioned as a Jesuit college for boys. In 1942, the building was bought and operated by the American Army during the building of the Alaska Highway, and in 1944, it was sold again to the Government of Canada. The Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps began to use the building as a hospital. In 1945, the hospital was inspected and approved for conversion to a tuberculosis hospital for Inuit and other First Nations groups in Alberta, the Yukon, and parts of the Northwest Territories. The hospital was jointly run by the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps and Indian Health Services, and in 1946, the hospital was named after Dr. Charles Camsell, a geologist and Deputy Minister of Mines and Resources from 1920 to 1946. In 1964, a new building was completed for the hospital, and the old college was demolished in 1967. Although the hospital was meant to treat tuberculosis, the Charles Camsell Hospital was also a site where patients were subjected to research. Many First Nations people were sterilized here between the 1960s and the 1980s. Charles Camsell Hospital is often linked to the 60s Scoop, where Indigenous children were fostered or adopted out, usually to non-Aboriginal families. As of the late 1990s, the government of the Northwest Territories created a program to encourage sterilization survivors to come forward, and a settlement was offered on a case-by-case basis.
The original caption of this photo is, quote, "There's no shortage of hearty appetites in the Tiny Tots ward. 93 nurses tend to the needs of patients together with a staff of 15 doctors and a dentist. Through a close working arrangement with the Edmonton area, the hospital may call on the professional and technical skill of outsiders when necessary to supplement its own highly trained staff and modern facilities." October 1st, 1958. National Film Board of Canada.
Frederick Tisdall, famous for being a co-creator of the infant food Pablum at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, along with Percy Moore and Lionel Bradley Pett, were the main architects of the nutrition experiments. They proposed that education and dietary interventions would make Indigenous people more profitable assets to Canada, that if Indigenous people were healthier, transmission of diseases like tuberculosis to white people would decline and assimilation would be easier. They successfully pitched their plan for nutrition experiments to the federal government. Tisdall, Moore, and their team based their pitch on the results they found after subjecting 400 Cree adults and children in northern Manitoba to a range of intrusive assessments including physical exams, x-rays, and blood draws. The pitch from Pett and his team centered on determining a baseline. They wanted to give children of the Albany Indian Residential School a low amount of milk for 2 years, enough to substantially deprive growing children of the calories and nutrients they needed. Other experiments involve withholding essential vitamins and minerals to children in control groups, while preventing Indian Health Services from providing dental care under the guise that this could impact the study results.
Pictured. A nurse takes a blood sample from a boy at the Indian School, Port Alberni, British Columbia, in 1948, during the time when nutritional experiments were being conducted on students there and at 5 other residential schools.
The 60 Scoop. By 1965, a more organized and concentrated effort by the government child welfare agencies began to remove Indigenous children from their homes. This was called the 60 Scoop, a practice continued throughout the 1970s and well into the 1980s. The government believed that if the children were removed from their homes early enough, they wouldn't imprint as Indigenous people. Therefore, the children lost their names, language, and connection to their family and culture. Many of the children, specifically through the Saskatchewan's Adopt Indian and Métis program, were featured in newspaper ads to find prospective adoptive families. During the 60 Scoop, status Indian children were 4.5 times more likely than non-Indigenous children to be in the care of child welfare authorities. Over 70% of them were adopted into non-Indigenous families across Canada and the U.S.
In 1985, Justice Edwin Kimmelman released a review of the 60 Scoop after reviewing the files of the children adopted to non-Indigenous families. Judge Kimmelman stated that, quote, "A cultural genocide has been taking place in a systematic, routine manner. The Kimmelman report marked the end of the 60 Scoop and resulted in 109 recommendations for the Indigenous child welfare system in Canada. The Department of Indian Affairs later revealed that a total of 11,132 status Indian children were adopted during the 60 Scoop throughout Canada and the United States. However, it is believed to be much higher, as many Indigenous children were not recorded as status in adoption and foster care records.
Recent full education today. Communities are remote. Many First Nations communities are remote and accessible by air or winter roads. Funding does not consider the expense of transportation of supplies, which can sometimes be double the value of the supplies themselves. Most remote communities do not have a high school or even qualified teachers to teach beyond grade 8. In our country today, students are flown out of their community into urban centers to receive their high school education. Indigenous parents must make the difficult decision to have their 13 to 15-year-old child billeted with extended family, friends, or strangers who are paid host parents. Students are given an address and a name, leave everything they know and the people they love, and put their lives and education into the hands of another adult or family who are responsible for their safety, well-being, and education. For instance, students living in northwestern communities in the Kenora district in Ontario stay with families in either Sioux Lookout or Thunder Bay. Students who live in northeastern Ontario are flown to Timmins and pursue their education there. This current system is a direct result of 150 years of the Canadian government's desire to control all aspects of Indigenous language, culture, and education, and it could be argued that today's system is a modern-day form of residential school. Unlike provincially funded high schools, federally run schools for Indigenous students do not have legislated core curriculums and do not have to call for or impose education standards. Many First Nations schools were underfunded and continue to be underfunded to this day due to a 2% funding cap. To compare, provincially run schools' funding increased annually by 3.8%, almost double the Indigenous cap during this time. A quote by Tanya Talaga, author of Seven Fallen Feathers. Since Talaga's book was written, the 2% cap has been lifted. However, as Talaga writes, lifting the cap does not address the 29% growth in the Indigenous population between 1996 and 2015. And while now on par with provincially funded schools, there remains obvious detrimental cumulative educational disparities, including lack of supplies, personnel, and educational representatives.
Quote, Canada can't afford to squander the potential of another generation of First Nations children. End quote. MP Charlie Angus, author, Children of the Broken Treaty.
Teach for Canada is an organization based out of Toronto supporting Indigenous student success by recruiting and developing committed educators in partnership with First Nations. Currently, there are 120 Teach for Canada educators working in 25 partner First Nations in Northern Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Teachers have launched student councils, coached sports teams, started music programs, led dance classes, developed school websites, hosted radio shows, organized field trips, run outdoor activities, and more. Their inspirational teaching is increasing student attendance, student engagement, and student achievement.
Matawa Education and Care Centre is an alternative secondary school approved by the Ontario Ministry of Education as an education and accommodation centre in the city of Thunder Bay for Matawa First Nation students from the 9 communities. 5 communities are accessible by air or seasonal winter road: Yabmaduk, Martin Falls, Niskandaga, Nibinamik, and Webuque. The remaining 4 are accessible by road throughout the year: Arolan, Long Lake 58, Constance Lake, and Kinogamink.
Anna Pelletier is an Anishnaabe water rights advocate, born on September 27, 2004 in Wikwemekong, Manitoulin Island, Ontario. She was raised on the shores of Lake Huron, one of the Great Lakes, the world's largest freshwater supply. At the age of 8, Peltier attended a ceremony at Serpent River First Nation near her home and saw signs that warned toxic drinking water. The community had been on boiled water advisory for over 10 years. Peltier learned about the importance of clean water and respecting the environment from her mother and her great-aunt. Today, Autumn is a world-renowned water rights advocate and leading global youth environmental activist, and advocates for the right to drink clean water, whether on reserves in Canada or in the developing world. Her efforts have been acknowledged globally. In April 2019, Peltier was appointed Chief Water Commissioner by the Anishnaabe Nation and has spoken about the issues of contaminated water on Indigenous reserves in Canada and the United Nations. Peltier has been quoted saying, "I advocate for water because we all came from water, and water is literally the only reason we are here today and living on this earth."
Youth advocate Shannon Kostachin. Shannon has been quoted as saying, "School is a time for dreams. Every kid deserves this." Shannon Kostachin, a youth from Attapiskat First Nation, led a movement to give Indigenous children the same educational opportunities as others, but with quality, culturally based education. Shannon's own school was closed because of contaminated grounds, and the children had to learn in run-down portables situated on those same grounds. Shannon and her classmate took her message to Parliament Hill in 2009 and demanded that the government provide better, safer schools for children living on reserves. Shannon tragically passed away in a car accident in 2010. Shannon's campaign to improve Indigenous education countrywide continues today as Shannon's Dream, a movement launched by children from Attapiskat in November 2010. It lives on through the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, a national nonprofit networking organization founded in 1998 and based in Ottawa. In 2019, a new school in Hamilton, Ontario, was named in her honor, Shannon Kostachin Elementary School.
Nwejinan is a mobile production studio whose name means "we live here" in James Bay, Eastern Cree. Nwejinan began as a one-week intensive program for Indigenous youth to learn about and acquire skills in sound recording, music production, songwriting, and performance. To date, more than 900 First Nations youth have participated across 70 communities, resulting in 140 songs and videos that have been viewed more than 20 million times online. Original songs are created that center on themes of cultural identity, language, struggle, love, and self-acceptance.
Recoveries. Since the 1970s, investigations into unmarked grave sites around residential schools have taken place using a variety of methods, including non-invasive archaeological tools such as ground-penetrating radar. The announcement of preliminary results from one such investigation at the former site of Kamloops Indian Residential School in May 2021 made international news and led to wider and renewed calls to investigate other former school sites for unmarked graves. Pictured is the main administrative building of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in 1970. The effort to fully document the children that never returned home from all schools is ongoing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified 1,953 children, 477 where additional investigation is required, and an additional 1,242 students where they are known to have passed away, but their names are not yet known. In total, there are presently 4,126 children within the National Student Memorial Register.
Reconciliation. Between 2009 and 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held hundreds of hearings and community events across the country. 4-day national events were held in Winnipeg, Inuvik, Halifax, Saskatoon, Montreal, Vancouver, and Edmonton, with large regional events occurring in Whitehorse and Victoria. Hundreds of thousands of people attended these events and hearings, with many more watching via live broadcast. The Commission recorded close to 7,000 statements during its mandate and amassed a collection of approximately 5 million documents from government and church archives.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. The TRC was given its mandate by the Indian Residential Schools Agreement, which, in part, stated the purpose of the commission was to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools in a manner that fully documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Aboriginal peoples and honors the resilience and courage of former students, their families, and their communities, and to guide and inspire a process of truth and healing toward reconciliation within Aboriginal families and between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal communities, churches, governments, and Canadians generally. The process was to work to renew relationships on a basis of inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect. The Honourable Murray Sinclair, Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has said, quote, "The road we travel is equal importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we are forced to go the distance." True North Aid is dedicated to serving northern and remote Indigenous communities in Canada with practical humanitarian support. With significant barriers in accessing goods and services in these communities, as well as striking levels of inequality in health and wellness outcomes, income, food, and housing, there is much work to be done. Since 2017, True North Aid has worked alongside Indigenous leadership and community members in over 100 communities across Canada. As a registered Canadian charity, our mandate is first to provide practical humanitarian assistance. Through our supplies and flagship programs, we provide a range of community-requested tangible items including new beds and bedding, school supplies, warm clothing, mobility aids, books, Lego, hygiene products, and more. Through our Community Initiatives program, we also support Indigenous-led, community-centered ambitions that include culture and language revitalization projects, food sovereignty programs, and traditional on-the-land events, to name but a few. True North Aid recognizes that our ongoing commitment to providing humanitarian assistance in northern and remote communities is a direct result of the tragic legacy of residential schools and the resulting socio-economic inequities experienced by Indigenous communities across Canada. True North Aid is therefore uniquely positioned to challenge Canadians to come alongside our organization to learn about our shared history and to participate in meaningful initiatives that answer the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Visit our website at www.truenorthaid.ca to learn more about us and the different ways that you can get involved. We believe in telling the truth about Canada's history. Therefore, we aim to keep our events as accessible and free to everyone when we can. However, if this event has assisted you in your learning, and if you would like to make a donation towards True North Aid's efforts, we welcome your contribution, and we thank you for joining us at our 2024 Reconciliation Walk.